Israeli warplanes weren't just striking targets inside Syria, they were hitting the very heart of the capital, Damascus, targeting the Syrian Defense Ministry headquarters itself. The chilling images that emerged sent shockwaves across the globe, a terrifying spectacle of a modern military unleashing its power on the command center of its decades-long adversary. This was no routine border skirmish.
This was a calculated, devastating series of attacks, a move that brought the entire Middle East to the absolute brink of a multi-front war. And the reason given for this terrifying escalation? To protect a small, fiercely loyal minority group, the Druze, who found themselves caught in the crossfire of a brutal new internal conflict.
Just as the world braced for an all-out war, a conflict that could drag in superpowers and their proxies and redraw the map of the region in blood, a stunning announcement came from Washington, D.C., delivered in the early hours of Saturday, July 19, 2025. A ceasefire, an agreement between Israel and Syria. But how could such a thing be possible mere hours after bombs fell on Damascus? How did we arrive at this precipice?
And is this ceasefire merely a paper-thin veil over a conflict that is boiling over with ancient ethnic hatred? A conflict that has already displaced 80,000 souls and left hundreds dead in a single horrific week? Today, we are going to untangle the explosive, complex, and deeply tragic situation in Syria's southern Sweida province. We will dive deep into the ancient allegiances and bitter rivalries between the Druze and the local Bedouin clans, a story far older than the current Syrian state. We'll examine the shocking decision by the Syrian government, supposedly there to keep peace, to take a side in the bloodshed. We will explore why Israel, in turn, risked a major international incident and a full-scale war to intervene so decisively. And most importantly, we will dissect this brand new ceasefire and ask the most critical question of all. Can a deal brokered in foreign capitals hold when the ground itself is still burning with the fires of revenge and despair? The fuse was lit on a Sunday, but the powder had been dry for years. In the Sweida province, a rugged, historically complex region in southern Syria, long simmering tensions between two distinct communities finally exploded into open warfare. On one side, the Druze, a unique and esoteric ethno-religious group with a proud warrior history and a fierce sense of independence, with communities spread across Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Their heartland in Syria is often called Jabal al-Druze, the Mountain of the Druze, a testament to their deep roots and historical struggle for autonomy. On the other, local Sunni Muslim Bedouin tribes, nomadic and semi-nomadic clans with their own deep roots in the region and their own codes of honor and survival. For years, the chaos of the Syrian civil war had paradoxically kept a lid on some of these local tensions, as all sides were focused on the larger national struggle. But with the war winding down, old grievances over land, water rights, and control of lucrative smuggling routes to Jordan began to resurface with a vengeance. The initial clashes were brutal and chaotic, a maelstrom of local militias fighting for control, for honor, and for their very existence. But this was different from past skirmishes. It quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous when the Syrian government forces of President Ahmed al-Shara intervened. Nominally, they arrived to restore order, to act as a stabilizing force between the warring factions. But their actions on the ground told a completely different and shocking story. Eyewitnesses and reports from the region confirmed that the government troops took a side. They sided with the Bedouins, turning their guns against the Druze. Suddenly, a local ethnic clash was transformed. It became a state-sanctioned assault on a minority group, a move that would have seismic geopolitical consequences. Why the Syrian government made this fateful decision remains a point of intense debate. Was it a strategic move to curry favor with the Sunni majority as al-Shara's new government tried to consolidate power? Was it a punishment for the Druze community's historic attempts at maintaining autonomy? Whatever the reason, it was a catastrophic miscalculation that poured gasoline on a raging fire and caught the attention of a powerful neighbor watching just across the border. That neighbor was Israel. The Israeli intervention was swift, massive, and utterly unprecedented in its audacity. This wasn't just a few retaliatory strikes to send a message. The Israeli Air Force launched dozens of sorties, pounding convoys of Syrian government fighters as they moved to engage the Druze. And then came the move that stunned the world, the direct hit on the Syrian Defense Ministry headquarters in central Damascus. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Israel was not merely observing, it was actively intervening in defense of the Druze, and it was willing to risk a direct confrontation with the Syrian state to do so. To understand this drastic action, you have to understand the unique and profound bond between the state of Israel and the Druze people. Within Israel, the Druze were not seen as just another minority. They are considered blood brothers, a deeply loyal and integrated community. Unlike other Arab citizens, Druze men serve in the Israeli military, often in elite combat units, and have fought and died for the state of Israel in every one of its wars. The idea of their Syrian kin being targeted and potentially massacred with the backing of the Syrian army created a moral and political firestorm within Israel. The pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu's government from Israeli Druze leaders was immense. But beyond the moral imperative, there was cold, hard strategy. Israel has long sought to prevent its enemies, particularly Iran and its proxies, from gaining a foothold in southern Syria. A Syrian army crackdown in Sweida could create a power vacuum, or a zone of instability that hostile forces could exploit, right on Israel's doorstep. The Israeli government framed its actions as military interventions necessary to protect a vulnerable population from slaughter. But in reality, it was a full-blown shadow war erupting into the open, with Israel effectively acting as the air force for the outgunned Druze militias on the ground. The image of the Syrian Defense Ministry under attack is a powerful symbol of how quickly this conflict spiraled out of control. If you're finding this breakdown insightful and want to support our in-depth analyses of complex global events, take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps our channel grow and reach more people. The human cost of this 1 week of fighting is staggering, a tragedy layered on top of the already immense suffering of the Syrian people. Hundreds of people were killed. The United Nations issued a grim estimate, stating that some 80,000 people were displaced from their homes since the clashes first erupted on that fateful Sunday. 80,000 men, women, and children cast into the wilderness, forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their lives upended in a storm of violence. The stories emerging from the ground, relayed by locals to media outlets, paint a horrifying picture of war crimes and brutality. There are accounts of Syrian government-affiliated fighters carrying out summary executions of Druze civilians. Testimonies speak of widespread looting, of homes being systematically ransacked and then burned to the ground, an attempt to erase the very presence of the community from their ancestral villages. The chaos completely shattered the fragile infrastructure of the Sweida province. The United Nations confirmed that essential services, the very basics of modern life, had utterly collapsed. Water and electricity were cut off. Telecommunication networks went down, severing contact with the outside world and leaving families desperate for news of their loved ones. Health facilities, already strained to the breaking point by years of war, were overwhelmed and unable to cope with the influx of casualties. Makeshift clinics in basements struggled to treat horrific wounds with dwindling supplies. For a region still trying to recover from the Syrian civil war, this new wave of violence was a devastating blow, creating a fresh humanitarian crisis and reopening wounds that had never truly healed. The suffering was not one-sided. As the conflict raged, it created new waves of refugees and a cycle of retribution that promised only more pain. Amidst the escalating violence and the looming threat of a full-scale war between Israel and Syria, international diplomacy scrambled to pull the region back from the brink. The first breakthrough came on Wednesday. Mediated by Washington, Turkey, and other Arab nations, President al-Shaara's government reached a truce directly with the Druze groups. It was a desperate attempt to de-escalate. According to the details of the deal, revealed by the Syrian interim president himself, the government agreed to a humiliating but necessary step. They would begin withdrawing their troops from the Sweida province. In their place, the very Druze militias they had been fighting were now tasked with overseeing internal security. It seemed like a victory for the Druze and their international backers. But the peace was fleeting, a mirage in a desert of hate. It lasted barely a day. By late Thursday, the fighting was flaring up once again. But this time, the dynamic had shifted. With the Syrian army in retreat, a power vacuum opened, and the conflict reverted to its original primal form, Druze versus Bedouin. State media began reporting that Druze militias, now in control of security, were carrying out revenge attacks against Bedouin communities.
It was a grim, predictable turn of events. The violence they had suffered was now being visited upon their neighbors, perpetuating the cycle of bloodshed. This new wave of violence triggered a fresh exodus. The governor of the neighboring Daraa province released a statement confirming that more than 1,000 Bedouin families had been displaced and fled to his province, seeking refuge from what he termed attacks on Bedouin tribes by outlaw groups.
The truce had not brought peace. It had simply removed one of the players, leaving the local combatants to settle their blood feuds. The situation was so dire that President al-Shara, whose troops had just withdrawn, announced that he was preparing to send special forces back in to break up clashes and resolve the conflict on the ground, a move that threatened to undo the truce entirely and reignite the conflict with the Druze.
It was against this backdrop of a failed truce, ongoing ethnic clashes, and the direct threat of renewed government intervention that the United States made its most dramatic move yet. Early on Saturday morning, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and special envoy for Syria, Tom Barrack, announced the bombshell agreement. In a post on the social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter, Barrack declared that Syria and Israel had agreed to a ceasefire.
This was the big one, an agreement not just between local militias, but between the two nation-states that had come to the precipice of war. Barrack's post laid out the key players who had supported this incredible diplomatic feat. He wrote, quote, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara, supported by the USA, State Secretary Marco Rubio, have agreed to a ceasefire embraced by Turkey, Jordan, and its neighbors, end quote.
The inclusion of Turkey and Jordan was critical. Jordan, sharing a long border with Syria, is terrified of further instability and refugee flows. Turkey seeks to cement its influence as a major player in the region. Their support gave the deal weight. However, the announcement was conspicuously light on details. Barrack did not disclose any specifics of the arrangement. What were the terms? Would there be a buffer zone? Would international monitors be deployed? These critical questions were left unanswered. This ambiguity is typical of high-stakes diplomacy, allowing all sides to claim victory, but it is also the deal's greatest weakness. Instead, Barrack issued a broad and hopeful appeal for peace and reconciliation. We call upon Druze, Bedouins, and Sunnis to put down their weapons, he wrote, and, together with other minorities, build a new and united Syrian identity in peace and prosperity with its neighbors. It was a noble vision, a call for unity that stood in stark, almost surreal contrast to the grim reality of executions, burned homes, and 80,000 displaced people in Sweida. The announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Syria is undoubtedly a major diplomatic achievement, one that has, for now, pulled the Middle East back from the edge of a catastrophic regional war. But a ceasefire between states does not automatically translate to peace between peoples. The fundamental conflict on the ground in Sweida remains dangerously unresolved. The hatred and mistrust between some Druze and Bedouin factions, now inflamed by a week of horrific bloodshed and revenge attacks, will not be erased by a post on social media. The 80,000 displaced people are still homeless. The hundreds of dead are still gone. The critical question is whether this high-level political agreement can impose a negative peace, the simple absence of war, long enough for any genuine reconciliation to begin. The signs are precarious. President al-Shara's threat to redeploy his special forces to Sweida hangs over the province like a storm cloud, directly contradicting the spirit of de-escalation. Can his government resist the temptation to reassert control? And will the Druze militias, now empowered, truly seek peace, or will they seek justice on their own terms? The fate of tens of thousands of people and the stability of an entire nation hang in the balance, dependent on this fragile top-down peace. We will be tracking every development in this volatile story, and if you want to stay informed, make sure you're subscribed to our channel with notifications turned on. You won't want to miss our future updates. In the end, we are left with a story of two different realities, coexisting in a fragile, terrifying balance. There is the reality of high diplomacy, of ambassadors and prime ministers, of a US-led peace initiative embraced by regional powers to avert a full-scale war. It's a reality where enemies can agree to a ceasefire to serve their larger strategic interests and step back from the abyss. But then there is the other reality, the one on the ground, in the dusty streets in farmlands of Sweida. This is a reality of fresh graves and smoldering homes, of families shattered by loss, and communities torn apart by a desire for revenge that can span generations. Washington has announced a peace between Jerusalem and Damascus, but for the Druze, the Bedouins, and the Sunnis of southern Syria, whose lives have been irrevocably broken, the real war may have just begun. The ultimate question remains unanswered. Can a peace brokered in the quiet halls of power survive the raw, burning hatred in the hearts of those who have lost everything? Or is this fragile ceasefire just a momentary pause, a deep breath before the next, even more devastating explosion of violence that consumes them all?